In 1885, First Lieutenant Fremont of the 3rd U.S. Artillery swore in front of the 3rd Auditor of the Treasury Department the following statement, quote, "In ordering the regiment to the then new stations on the Pacific, where we were to remain for a long period, large supplies were advised to be taken, and an advance of 3 months' pay was ordered to be made to enable us to supply our needs and all of the supplies with that means purchased, and a vastly greater amount, the accumulation of years of service, were lost on that unseaworthy ship."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story, A Small Flaw in the San Francisco?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The San Francisco was launched in 1853 from the Webb shipyards in New York. The 2,500-ton Sidewheel steamship was built specifically for the Pacific Mail Steamship Company. She was considered an unusually luxurious ship, with an emphasis on large ports and skylights to allow air and light to enter the cabins. The San Francisco was designed to carry 300 cabin passengers and 1,000 people. Made with Maryland oak, carefully inspected, and predicted to beat the previous speed records of the Golden Gate, she was immediately given an A1 insurance rating by Lloyd's. It was the intention of the Pacific Mail Steamship Company to have her run between San Francisco and Panama, but first they would have to bring her to the Pacific coast. This was a convenient circumstance for the United States government, who chartered the ship for the passage to carry 8 companies of the 3rd Regiment of the United States Artillery, in total about 500 men, from New York to San Francisco, where they would join Companies F and N, which had been in California since 1848. In addition to the artillery companies and some of the men's families, several cabin passengers also boarded the ship for its passage through the Strait of Magellan. Captain Watkins, who was considered a good and experienced captain, watched the loading of the ship with some concern. In addition to the stores in the hold and the baggage of the troops that filled up a good deal of the ship's steered space, 750 tons of coal was also loaded, more than the ship's bunkers could hold. The vessel was concerningly overloaded in Captain Watkins' estimation, but though he voiced his concerns, nothing was done, and he could only say that he hoped that they avoided a storm until some of the coal was at least burned off, and the ship was lightened at least a little. Captain Watkins had very little say in such matters, since his ship was under government contract, and they had agreed to carry the troops as well as all of their supplies. The troops, meanwhile, had been told that their new post was going to be very remote, and that they might be there for as long as 8 years, and they, therefore, were bringing with them as much as they could. At 9 in the morning on the 22nd of December, the San Francisco departed from New York, and the next day they enjoyed good weather as Captain Watkins had hoped. Unfortunately, on the morning of the 24th of December, about 200 miles from Charleston, a violent storm blew in from the northwest. When the storm hit the San Francisco, it showed that she had earned the fanfare when she was launched. She was described as having plowed through the waves without difficulty. Lieutenant Murray of the United States Navy said that she was the easiest vessel they had ever sailed in. That he felt this way was a testimony to the hard work of Captain Watkins, who felt his ship struggling against the storm, and overladen as she was, struggling against the waves. Every sail that they attempted to use was blown to shreds in the storm, and they were completely dependent on the ship's engines. Captain Watkins ordered that his chief engineer give the ship as much speed as he believed to be prudent, which proved to be around 10 knots. In an attempt to help the ship manage through the storm better, Captain Watkins also ordered all of the troops to the forward part of the vessel, except for those that were able to lay on the floor of the upper saloon. That lasted until 12 o'clock that night, when the engine of the San Francisco came to a sudden stop. The piston of the air pump, a small piece estimated to only be 2.5 inches in diameter, and a new design, had broken, rendering the entire engine useless. The ship, which had been managing so well in the storm, was suddenly at the mercy of the waves. The ship was now also taking on water, and the steam pumps were put to work trying to empty the water, while hand pumps were also deployed, and a bucket chain made up of the troops was set to bail water up through the engine room. At 7 in the morning, they lost their foremast. It was a first sign that the ship, though strongly built, was no longer able to withstand the force of the waves. The passengers were immediately aware of the danger they were in after the engine stopped. The cabin passengers gathered in the lower cabin, where they began a group prayer for preservation. Throughout the night, everyone on the ship was filled with concern that at any moment the ship could begin to break apart with the way that the waves were hitting her. These fears were realized around 8 or 9 in the morning, when a massive wave hit her amidships, and it took with it the entire main saloon, the paddle boxes, the ship's smokestacks, and all 9 of the ship's lifeboats. With the upper cabins and staterooms that were swept away, also went all of the passengers who had been in them. This was later calculated to be at least 150 men, including 4 of the officers of the regiment and a few of the crew members. The passengers who had gathered in the lower cabin suddenly found themselves standing in 3 feet of water. Filled with immediate fear that the ship was sinking beneath their feet, the passengers panicked and surged to the deck. There they found the decks strewn with wreckage from the parts of the ship that had separated, as well as the remains of some of the victims who had been lost due to being hit by debris or thrown around by the wave. This did not do anything to improve the outlook of the passengers who had come from the lower cabin. A few of the passengers were so panicked that they threw themselves overboard and were lost. But a majority of the passengers simply huddled together on the deck, too frightened to go below decks again out of concern that the ship would sink and they would be trapped. The cold waves repeatedly washed over them. On some occasions, people would be washed off the San Francisco, only to then have the next wave wash them back onto the ship. Sergeant Brown reported later that he had been washed off the ship at least 4 times, and some of the other soldiers and cabin passengers said they had experienced a similar ordeal. A wave also washed back on board one of the soldiers who had been caught up in the loss of the upper cabins of the San Francisco. He had risen to the surface of the ocean to find that all around him was shattered pieces of timber, and the San Francisco was already half a mile away. He clung to his piece of timber with another man until it proved too frail to support both of them, and then he moved to another piece of wood and began to make his way back to the San Francisco. 2 or 3 large waves were all that it took for him to get back alongside the ship, and at first he grabbed a rope, but he did not have the strength to climb it. Another wave carried him to the forward deck, where he was able to break a stateroom window and crawl to safety. For the soldiers who had been working the hand pumps and bailing, the sudden surge of water, as well as the sudden loss of so many of their companions, with one wave, had been enough to create a sense of despair, and it took some cajoling to get them to continue work to try to save themselves. The ship was low enough in the water that more soldiers had to be detailed to hold blankets around the shaft for the paddle box to prevent water from coming in that way. Lieutenant Winder, though which Lieutenant Winder is uncertain because there were 2 on board, reached the deck after the upper cabins had been washed away later than the others due to having fallen asleep. He immediately formed the firm conviction, due to how low the ship was in the water, that the deck had separated from the hull and was now nothing more than a floating raft on the seas. Feeling that going below decks or into the lower cabins offered no protection, therefore, Lieutenant Winder instead went to shelter in the mizzenmast, where Lieutenant Murray of the U.S. Navy had also found a place, Lieutenant Winder was also under the impression that the ship had broken in half, and the men continued in this belief until the ship's first officer came with an axe with the intention of chopping down the mizzenmast that they were clinging to. The men were forced to abandon their shelter, but the first officer did not succeed in his task. The ship was rocking so violently that he was not able to take down the mast, and it remained where it was. The water was now primarily crashing over the aft of the ship, and the forward of the ship was now relatively safe, but with the storm raging on, neither end of the ship was aware of how the others were faring. There was no hope of making the ship more manageable by hoisting canvas. The storm was still blowing with enough strength that they were worried they would lose more men if they attempted to replace sails. The next day, Christmas Day, there was nothing to celebrate on board of the San Francisco. The storm continued with the same force, and the ship continued to take on water. Throughout the day, anyone who was not busy pumping out the ship was put to work dumping supplies and coal overboard in an attempt to lighten the ship. They also met with the first ship they had seen since they had begun to struggle. The ship was the Napoleon out of Portland, which promised to stand by in case they had to evacuate the San Francisco. Taking them on board was not something they were eager to do since the Napoleon was short on supplies. It was later reported that the Napoleon was all too happy to pull the supplies that the San Francisco was dumping overboard from the sea for their own use. It was not until that evening that the storm abated a little that they were able to lower the water levels enough that the chief engineer was able to return to the engine room to try to repair the air pump. The next morning, the weather had turned nasty again, and the Napoleon was no longer anywhere in sight. This was met with some bitterness since the people on board the San Francisco had seen them taking the supplies that they were jettisoning, but they continued the fight to keep the San Francisco afloat. The engineers continued to struggle to fix the engine of the ship, while the soldiers continued to try to keep the water levels low and throw supplies overboard. When the weather grew calm again, later in the day, they tore down the shattered remains of the quarterdeck and erected a canvas shelter in its place. Around noon they spoke with a brig named the Maria out of Liverpool. Just like the Napoleon, the Maria told them that they would stand by, but just like the Napoleon, they gathered some supplies that the San Francisco was still throwing overboard, and then disappeared in the night. The next morning, around 10 in the morning, the engineers who, just like the men fighting the rising waters, had been working around the clock, announced that they were ready to start the engines again. For 10 minutes, the engines worked again before the air pump that had been mended broke again, and the engine once again failed. Since the weather was more moderate and the engine was still not working, an attempt was made instead for the mizzen sail to be replaced so they would at least have some means to control the ship again. This was succeeded in, but in the process one of the sailors was lost overboard. The mood on the ship was quickly dropping again, and it was reported that the raw recruits among the soldiers in particular had given up hope again and began to stop work. They once again had to be cajoled into not giving up, with Sergeant Brown in particular being called out for having led by example, in spite of his ordeal of having repeatedly been washed overboard. It was reported that he had not rested, but pushed himself to keep going for almost 5 days until he collapsed from exhaustion. For the families of the troops who were also on board, as well as the injured, things were not much more comfortable. Though they were not expected to engage in hard labor, they only had ship biscuits to eat for the first few days, and drinking water was only a dream. Several soldiers attempted to get some from the forward part of the ship, only to be washed away. Colonel Gates, the commander of the regiment, eventually decided to go at the risk of his life and retrieved some. Occasionally, Captain Watkins or Lieutenant Murray, who was assisting him, would come down to comfort them, but for the most part, they could only guess what was happening. On the day that they woke up to find the Maria gone, they were finally able to eat something other than ship's biscuit. Some preserved meats had been brought up for everyone to eat, which was met with relief. Unfortunately, fresh squalls also came in, and the people in the cabin became determined that the cabin that they were in was about to give way. They were so determined, Major Weiss put on a life preserver and fastened his baby to him, ready to end up in the water. Fortunately, Captain Watkins and Colonel Gates were able to secure the hatches, which prevented further water from entering the ship, and the panic subsided, especially as the weather grew milder again. Though no one was aware of it yet, a new disaster was about to rear its head. The preserved meat, which everyone had celebrated, must not have been preserved very well, because people soon became violently ill with a stomach complaint. In addition, they had not had any means to cook it, which added to the danger. The galley of the ship had been among the places lost to the waves. The first night, it would only claim one man, a waiter, but it would soon claim many more. On December 28th, Captain Watkins was able to speak with the Kilby of Boston under the command of Captain Lowe, a bark, which, like the other two ships before it, promised to stand by, but did more than that. On the 29th, in spite of the still dangerous seas, Captain Watkins had himself taken over to the Kilby in a small boat and spoke with her captain. Kilby said that it could take some of the people off the San Francisco, though he could not fit everyone. His ship was also very short of supplies. They only had a pound of meat on board when they met with the San Francisco, though unlike the Napoleon and the Maria, Captain Lowe and his crew did not see this as a reason to not attempt to save lives. On the afternoon of the 29th, the two ships were connected by a hawser, and the transfer of people began. In total, 106 people were brought from the San Francisco to the Kilby, with an emphasis on families and the injured. Colonel Gates and his family, as well as Lieutenant Murray, were among those who were transferred. They also brought over some bacon and bread as supplies to help ease the short supplies of the Kilby. They left the hawser connected, but at 10 at night, the storm grew in power again, and the hawser parted. The next morning, they found that they could no longer see the San Francisco. For 3 days they searched, but could not find the distressed ship, and their supplies were running too short to continue the search. Captain Lowe declared that they would head for the closest land, but this would take time since the winds were against them. Food was estimated to be enough to last them 6 or 7 days, was made to last 16 days, with each person getting a gill of water, a gill of tea, and a gill of corn per day. Even with this rationing, they would have run out of water if they had not had snow and rain a couple of times. Unfortunately, as they got close to land, the weather was so nasty that Captain Lowe decided that, rather than crash on the coast, it was better to stand out from the shore again. It was a decision that almost caused a mutiny, and it was not until Lieutenant Murray stepped in and explained that he agreed with Captain Lowe's decision that things calmed down. Fortunately, the next day they met with the Lucy Thompson under the command of Captain Pendleton. The quartermaster of the regiment was sent over to negotiate a government charter for the vessel to carry them to safety, which was quickly agreed to, and almost all of the passengers were brought over to the much better supplied Lucy Thompson. A dozen soldiers remained on the Kilby, saying it was their intention to help him bring his vessel into port. On hearing this, Captain Pendleton sent over enough food for several weeks, as well as some fresh sails. On board Lucy Thompson, the survivors entered the cabin to find what, to their famished eyes, appeared to be a feast. Word also sent ahead when they were off of Sandy Hook, and they were met with a steam tug full of clothing and essentials, sent by the father of one of the officers who also offered his house to all who had come into the port on the Lucy Thompson. The Kilby would soon follow, also safely reaching port. The San Francisco had taken on the appearance of a plague ship, with sick people from the preserved meat being lost every hour. Matters were made worse because the medical staff of the regiment were among those who had left on the Kilby. Still, the work went on of tossing coal overboard and trying to keep the ship free of water, as well as plugging holes as they were discovered. On the 3rd of January, they met with the 3 Bells under the command of Captain Crichton. Brevet Major Ways, now the highest-ranking officer on board, was sent over to the new ship to charter her for government use and save them. A new storm blew in again, however, and through the night the San Francisco had to fire guns to tell the 3 Bells where they were. The next morning they saw another ship, and leaving nothing to chance, Captain Watkins ordered a distress signal be flown. The new ship proved to be the Antarctic, under the command of Captain Stouffer, who said that he would take all of them off. Meanwhile, the 3 Bells had also fought her way back. Both ships sent boats. Due to the weather, it would not be until the morning of the 6th that everyone was off of the San Francisco. They sent over not only people to the 2 rescuing ships, but also supplies. By the end of the ordeal, the Antarctic only had 1 boat left, all the rest of her boats having been smashed in the rescue efforts, though fortunately without loss of life. Captain Watkins, his first officer, and his chief engineer were the last men to leave the ship. Out of concern that the wreckage of the San Francisco might damage an unsuspecting ship, it being a major shipping lane, the San Francisco was scuttled behind them, having never even reached her namesake and intended home port. Out of the troops alone, 182 people were lost. This did not include the other passengers and the crew members. In total, the final count of those lost was estimated to be close to 220, if not higher. Considering the circumstances, the fact that over 500 people had survived the ordeal was considered to be miraculous, and praise and rewards were heaped on the heads of the captains of the Kilby, 3 Bells, and the Antarctic. Captain Watkins was also highly praised for his actions and tireless energy, which had kept the San Francisco afloat long enough for such a rescue to take place. The 3rd Artillery was still expected to take its place in California, and the next spring, Brevet Major Ways was ordered to board the steamer Falcon in command of 4 of the companies to take up their new post. The 3rd Artillery was still very short in officers due to the many lives lost on the San Francisco, and many things were expected of Brevet Major Ways. Only hours before they were supposed to board, however, Brevet Major Ways told his superiors that he did not consider the ship to be seaworthy, and that he would not be getting on board. His refusal to board a ship that had been inspected and deemed acceptable by the military was met with a court-martial which should have ended his career. Indeed, his dismissal from the service had been signed by the president, but he met with a reprieve. There was a quiet acknowledgment that sometimes ships that were inspected were still not completely seaworthy, and that Brevet Major Ways had reasons for his doubts after the ordeal of the San Francisco, during which he had performed with distinction. He was still ordered to travel to meet his companies in California, though. For more information, please see The Rudder, Volume 21, edited by Thomas Fleming Day, published March 1909, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.